Snow fell in heavy, muffled sheets across the jagged ridges of the Alps, swallowing sound and turning stone into shifting ghosts. Roman scouts stationed at the foothills peered upward, certain that no mortal army could possibly emerge from such frozen peaks. For weeks, their commanders had dismissed rumors from Gaul. Whispers of a foreign host advancing, of strange beasts taller than houses, of a general who swore vengeance upon Rome itself. Then the silence of the mountains cracked. First came the rumble of loosened rock, then the crackle of fire, and then, most terrifying of all, a deep, rolling thunder. The footsteps of something alive, something immense, moving in a place where only avalanches belonged. Out of the white curtain of snow appeared silhouettes no Roman had ever dreamed to see here. Elephants armored and frost-covered, tusks glinting like iron spears, their eyes burning red from smoke and torchlight. Behind them marched tens of thousands of men. At their head rode a commander whose name would soon become Rome's darkest nightmare, Hannibal Barca. To understand why these elephants stood upon alpine cliffs in the winter of the year 218 before the Common Era, we must turn to the bitter rivalry that defined the ancient Mediterranean. This was the Second Punic War, which lasted from the year 218 before the Common Era to the year 201 before the Common Era, a conflict between Carthage, the great maritime empire of North Africa, and Rome, the rising Republic of Italy. Carthage had ruled the western Mediterranean for centuries. Its harbors bustled with trade ships, its silver mines in Spain fed its treasury, and its merchants grew rich on purple dyes, salt, and grain. Rome, once a small city-state on the Tiber River, had expanded into a disciplined power whose citizen legions steadily absorbed the Italian peninsula. Their interests clashed first over the island of Sicily, and the struggle that followed, the First Punic War, which lasted from the year 264 before the Common Era to the year 241 before the Common Era, endured more than 2 decades. Rome emerged victorious, seizing Sicily and demanding crippling tribute. Carthage's navy was shattered, its pride broken, and its treasury drained. For the Carthaginians, the loss was more than military. It was humiliation. Families who had buried their sons during the First Punic War whispered of vengeance. Among them was Hannibal Barca, one of Carthage's most brilliant generals. Hamilcar had never been defeated in open battle, but politics and Roman persistence had forced him to abandon Sicily. When Rome imposed crushing payments, Hamilcar looked westward to rebuild. He led Carthage into Iberia, the land of modern Spain, rich in silver, soldiers, and resources. There, he began to forge a new empire, one that might one day challenge Rome again. At his side was his young son, Hannibal. Ancient writers tell us that Hamilcar brought the boy to a sacred altar and made him swear a solemn oath to the gods. Eternal hatred of Rome. Whether this scene was literal or legend, it shaped the destiny of one of history's greatest commanders. Hamilcar's campaigns expanded Carthage's influence across Spain, and when he died, leadership passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal. Hasdrubal strengthened Carthaginian control, founded the city of Carthago Nova, which is modern Cartagena, and maintained a fragile peace with Rome. But in the year 221 before the Common Era, Hasdrubal was assassinated. The army, seasoned and loyal to the Barcid family, chose the young Hannibal as their commander. He was still in his 20s, yet already proven in battle. The oath of his childhood now burned as a mission. Hannibal inherited an army unlike any Rome had ever faced. It was a mosaic of cultures and skills. North African infantry with long spears and heavy shields, fierce Iberian warriors wielding curved falcata swords, swift Numidian cavalry whose horsemen could outmaneuver any enemy, and towering above them all, the African war elephants. These elephants were smaller than the Indian breed but no less fearsome. They carried towers with javelin throwers, and their charge could smash through infantry lines or scatter cavalry. To Hannibal, they were more than weapons. They were symbols, living embodiments of Carthaginian power, designed to terrify Rome before a single sword was drawn. The spark of open war was struck in the year 219 before the Common Era at the Spanish city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome. Hannibal besieged it for 8 months. When Saguntum fell, Rome demanded his surrender. Carthage refused. War was declared. Rome expected Hannibal to defend Spain or sail across the Mediterranean. Instead, he conceived a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. He would march his army overland, across Gaul, and then through the Alps, a natural wall that most thought impassable. If he succeeded, he would arrive in Italy not as a raider but as an invading storm, catching Rome unprepared. In the spring of the year 218 before the Common Era, Hannibal assembled his host, nearly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. It was one of the largest armies ever fielded by Carthage. With them marched engineers, camp followers, pack animals, and the supplies of an entire expedition. His route carried him over the Ebro River, through hostile tribes and across Gaul. Roman envoys attempted to rally Gallic resistance against him, but Hannibal's diplomacy was swift. Some tribes he courted with gifts, others he crushed with violence. By the time he reached the Rhone River, he had outmaneuvered both enemies and time. Roman forces under Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the man who would later become known as Scipio Africanus, were racing north to intercept him. The Rhone posed the first true test of Hannibal's audacity. The river was wide, swift, and deep. To cross it with elephants was thought impossible. Hannibal's engineers built massive rafts lashed together with timbers and covered them with earth to resemble solid ground. Onto these trembling platforms the elephants were coaxed. Terrified, they trumpeted and stamped, some plunging into the current. But even there, their trunks rose above the waves like living snorkels, guiding them to the far bank. Roman scouts, watching from a distance, returned to their commanders shaken. Hannibal had not only crossed the Rhone, he had done it with beasts Rome had never imagined seeing in battle on Italian soil. Yet the Rhone was only a prelude. Beyond it loomed the Alps, the greatest natural barrier in Europe. Jagged, snow-choked peaks that reached into the clouds, a wall of stone and ice between Gaul and Italy. Local tribes warned of avalanches that devoured whole villages, of cliffs where even goats would not walk, of storms that buried armies in snow. Rome believed no invader would dare. Hannibal believed this impossibility was his greatest weapon. The march into the Alps began in the late autumn of the year 218 before the Common Era. Hannibal understood that these mountains would be his most merciless opponent, fiercer even than the Roman legions that awaited him on the other side. Snow already dusted the upper ridges, and cold winds swept through the valleys like knives. His army, burdened with supplies, weapons, and 37 elephants, advanced into a world that seemed built to break them. The climb began gently enough, but soon the path narrowed to ledges scarcely wider than a man's shoulders. Beneath them yawned abysses so deep that falling stones took seconds before their sound faded into silence. Soldiers clung to ropes hammered into the rock, dragging their spears and shields behind them. Pack animals slipped on the ice, and their terrified screams echoed for minutes as they tumbled into nothingness. The men grew hollow-eyed, their breath visible in ragged clouds. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Each step forward was not merely a march but a victory wrested from the mountain itself. Hannibal did not lead from the rear. He moved among his men on horseback when the path allowed, and on foot when it narrowed. Ancient writers describe him cloaked in while stiffened by frost, his face battered by wind, speaking constantly to his soldiers. Sometimes he encouraged them with promises of rich Italian fields beyond the peaks. At other times, he threatened those who faltered, reminding them that to turn back was to die at the hands of both the mountains and the Romans. Unlike many commanders, Hannibal endured the same hardships as his army. He ate the same meager rations, he marched through the same storms, and he froze beneath the same winds. His presence was iron binding the army together. But the mountains were not the only enemy. The tribes of the high valleys watched from their fortified villages, waiting for weakness. They rolled boulders onto narrow trails, ambushed stragglers with arrows and javelins, then melted into the mist. Hannibal's veterans fought them off, but each skirmish drained strength and supplies. Once, a tribal chieftain pretended to offer peace. He promised Hannibal safe passage if the Carthaginian army marched through his territory. Hannibal agreed, but at dawn, the tribesmen struck from both sides of a gorge. Stones and spears rained down, breaking the column into chaos. Soldiers scattered, elephants trumpeted in terror, and panic threatened to undo the entire march. Only Hannibal's personal intervention, rallying his veterans, leading charges uphill against the attackers, and forcing a bloody breakout, saved his army from destruction. From that day forward, the soldiers marched with shields raised over their heads, wary of a sky filled not with rain but with stone. Then came the greatest obstacle. After days of climbing, the army reached a rockslide that blocked the pass for miles. Towering cliffs hemmed them in, and there was no way around. Snow piled high, ice sealed the stones, and morale began to collapse. Here Hannibal revealed the ingenuity that made him more than a soldier. He was an engineer of war. His men gathered timber, stacked it against the cliff face, and soaked it with oil. They lit the pyre, and fire roared into the frozen night. The rocks glowed red. When they were hot enough, the soldiers poured vinegar over them. The sudden change split the stone into fragments. For days, men worked with axes and crowbars, dragging rubble aside until a new path opened. The sight of fires burning against snow, black smoke curling into the heavens, gave birth to a legend. Hannibal had set the Alps themselves aflame. Food dwindled to nothing. Soldiers boiled leather straps for broth, gnawed bark stripped from frozen trees, and dug with bare hands for roots beneath the snow. Horses collapsed from hunger, their carcasses stripped before the bodies cooled. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and noses, leaving men maimed for life. Each forward step became a triumph over nature itself. Hannibal shared the same fate. His cloak froze stiff on his shoulders. His eyes burned from the smoke of endless fires. Yet he never ceased moving among the ranks, encouraging some, chastising others, always reminding them of Rome waiting beyond the mountains. At last, after weeks of torment, the column reached the highest pass. The world opened before them in a vista both terrifying and triumphant. Far below stretched the Italian plain, dark forests and gleaming rivers visible in the distance. For one breathless moment, the soldiers forgot their hunger and their wounds. Hannibal raised his arm and declared that Italy lay at their feet. His words carried on the icy wind like a promise of deliverance. For all the suffering, this was proof that they had not bled in vain. Yet the descent proved even deadlier than the climb. Snow turned trails into glass, and men slid to their deaths. Avalanches thundered in the night, burying entire camps in silence. Soldiers tied themselves together with ropes, hoping that if one fell, others might hold him. Fires burned constantly, their smoke clinging to the valley walls. Again, Hannibal used cunning to turn fear into weapon. Knowing Roman scouts shadowed his progress, he ordered logs soaked in oil, fastened them to wooden frames, dragged them to ridges above the paths, and set them ablaze. To Roman eyes, the mountains seemed alive with fire. And then came the elephants. Pushed forward with torches, their silhouettes loomed like monsters from another world. Some accounts, told later by terrified Romans, claimed that Hannibal tied burning bundles to the backs of the beasts, their tusks sheathed in iron, their shapes haloed in flame as they thundered through the snow. Whether every detail was true did not matter. The image spread faster than truth itself. To the Romans, Hannibal's elephants were no longer animals. They were demons of the Alps, fire and fury descending into Italy. By the time the Carthaginian host emerged from the mountains, the price had been staggering. Out of nearly 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry who had left Spain, perhaps 40,000 remained. Of the 37 elephants, fewer than 20 survived. But those who staggered into the plains of northern Italy were hardened like steel. They had faced hunger, avalanches, and endless ambushes. They had not broken. For Rome, their arrival was not an invasion. It was an apparition. No one had believed such a feat possible. Now, as Hannibal's battered but unbroken army marched into the fertile lands of the Po Valley, the Senate trembled. The gods, it seemed, had delivered Rome's darkest nightmare. A Carthaginian army, led by a man sworn to Rome's destruction, and flanked by elephants that had conquered the impossible. When Hannibal's army finally descended from the Alps in the late autumn of the year 218 before the Common Era, they were shadows of the force that had set out from Spain. Their bodies were scarred, their clothes torn to rags, and their numbers cut in half. Yet the men who survived were hardened by suffering, and the elephants that remained, perhaps fewer than 20 out of the original 37, had become symbols of endurance. To the Italians who watched this ghostly host march from the mountain passes, it seemed as if the gods themselves had unleashed Carthage upon the Roman Republic. Rome was stunned. Scouts reported men wrapped in hides like savages, faces blackened by smoke, eyes hollow with hunger. They spoke of elephants armored and scarred, trumpeting defiantly as if to declare victory over the mountains. The Senate, hearing these reports, realized the war had reached their own soil. No longer was the conflict a distant struggle in Spain or Africa. It was here in Italy itself. Hannibal wasted no time. Winter pressed close and supplies were scarce. He needed a victory, something to prove to his men that their suffering had meaning, and something to terrify Rome into hesitation. The opportunity came at the Battle of the River Trebia in December of the year 218 before the Common Era. The Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus was eager for glory. He believed Hannibal's army was too exhausted to fight. Hannibal, knowing this arrogance, prepared a trap. He placed his cavalry on the wings, hid a strong detachment in the reeds along the river, and positioned his elephants at the front of his line. At dawn, Hannibal's light cavalry provoked the Romans into pursuit. The legionaries crossed the freezing river, their armor soaked, their bodies shivering. On the far bank, they were met by Carthaginian infantry who had eaten, warmed themselves, and waited for the signal. Then the elephants charged. The Roman cavalry horses panicked at the smell, sound, and sight of the beasts. Trumpets blared, the elephants trumpeted back, and the Roman lines broke. At that moment, the hidden Carthaginian detachment struck from the reeds, cutting into the Roman rear. The legion collapsed into chaos. Thousands were cut down in the snow, and thousands more fled in terror. Hannibal had announced his arrival in Italy with a roar that shook Rome's confidence to its foundations. Rome reeled, but it did not break. The next spring, in the year 217 before the Common Era, Hannibal struck again. The Roman consul Gaius Flaminius marched with a large army to confront him near Lake Trasimene. The ground there was perfect for Hannibal's style of war. A narrow road hugged the lake's edge, with steep hills rising above. In the early morning, fog settled thick over the valley. Hannibal hid his infantry and cavalry in those hills, leaving only a small force visible by the shore. When Flaminius led his legions along the road, the Carthaginian horns blared. From every slope, soldiers erupted from the fog. The Romans were trapped between lake and hill, unable to form proper ranks. Panic spread. Men stumbled into the water, drowning beneath the weight of their armor. Others were cut down without ever seeing their attackers. By day's end, 30,000 Romans were dead or captured. It was the largest ambush in ancient history. Hannibal had shown that he could turn Italy itself into a weapon. But the greatest test still lay ahead. In the summer of the year 216 before the Common Era, Rome gathered the largest army in its history, nearly 80,000 men, determined to crush Hannibal once and for all. Hannibal commanded perhaps half that number. The two forces met near the town of Cannae in southern Italy. The plain was wide and flat, perfect for Rome's massive infantry force. Hannibal, however, turned this to his advantage. He arranged his troops in a crescent, with his center thin and flexible, and his strongest African veterans placed on the wings. As the battle began, the Romans pressed into the center, forcing it backward. Believing victory at hand, they surged forward. Hannibal's plan unfolded. The Carthaginian center bent but did not break. The African infantry on the wings held their ground, then pivoted inward. At the same time, Hannibal's cavalry, led by the swift Numidians, drove off the Roman horsemen and swept around to the rear. The Roman army, 80,000 men strong, found itself encircled. Packed so tightly they could not swing their swords, the legionaries suffocated, trampled, or were cut down. The killing lasted hours. By nightfall, as many as 50,000 Romans lay dead. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. Cannae became a name of terror, studied by generals for centuries. The elephants at Cannae were few and played little direct role. Yet their presence before the battle, looming on the horizon, tusks gleaming, trunks trumpeting, haunted the imagination of the Roman soldiers. For many who had never seen such creatures, their appearance was proof that Hannibal's army was not merely human but monstrous. Hannibal understood that fear was a weapon as sharp as any sword. After Cannae, southern Italy trembled. Cities defected to Hannibal and allies abandoned Rome. For a moment, it seemed that the Republic itself might collapse. Yet Rome did not surrender. Unlike other states, it endured its defeats. The Senate raised new armies, mobilized more citizens, and trusted in Fabius' delaying strategy. Gradually, Hannibal's position weakened. Reinforcements from Carthage never came in the strength he needed. His allies faltered. His elephants were gone. The storm that had burst from the Alps became a shadow lingering in southern Italy.